Good afternoon, good morning, good day, good evening, whatever time it is while you're joining us. I know Samir posted good morning. I'm in the afternoon segment of that. Kyla, I think you're about midday on that, where you're up at Central Time. You're almost, actually, you're in the afternoon at this point. But welcome everybody to what we know is going to be an extraordinary session to talk about the 4 Ds to a successful project. And I am merely the warm-up act. My name is Quentin Iman. I am a member of the Higher Ed Advisory Council. I've also been a Salesforce administrator at my institution, Santa Fe College, for about 10 years. Whether that gives me any credence to be here or not, you're not going to hear much from me. You are here to hear from the truly brilliant Kyla Farroll, who's going to talk about some really extraordinary things about making your project really live and really thrive and be dynamic. There's another D, dynamic. Dynamic's another D. We can add to that. It's not a verb, but I'm not going to tell Kyla how to do her presentation. I am here rambling on for no reason, but to tell you this, a little bit of housekeeping. I will be moderating some Q&A with Kyla at the end of her presentation, and the Q&A is going to come from you. As you may have heard earlier on in Higher Ed Dreamin, go to the session tab in the top right of your screen and click on Q&A. That's the place to put questions. If you happen to sneak questions into the chat, I'll look for them there too over the course of Kyla's presentation. But if you put them in the Q&A, that's the better place for them to go. And if you see a question that's already posted that you agree with and you want to have that question asked, just upvote it with a thumbs up. I'll look for the ones that have the most upvotes and we'll ask those in order. And hopefully we'll have 5 to 10 minutes at the end of Kyla's presentation to be able to deal with some of those questions. But enough from me. I'm going to pass it over and sing On Wisconsin, which is a really great fight song, up to Madison. I will not sing, I promise, Kyla. I will not. But let's pass it over to Kyla to hear more about the 4 Ds that'll get you to a successful project. Kyla, it's all you.
All right. Thank you so much, Quentin. And yes, good morning or good afternoon to you all. Thank you so much for joining the session. My name is Kyla Farroll. I am the Associate Director of Enterprise CRM and Engagement Solutions here at UW-Madison. My team is responsible for rolling out Salesforce across the entire university. My team also supports our enterprise marketing automation solution. We happen to use Eloqua, and we are in the process of building out a domain-driven strategy where we have a few different orgs. As you can see here on the screen, we're supporting pre-enrollment, learner success, external relations, and also identity and access management with a profile solution, which allows our constituents to be able to manage some of their own person data. So right now we are building out these orgs with a hopefully the future of bringing them all together, sharing data across those orgs. And as you can see, we use multiple different applications as well. So we're well on our way, very proud of the work that the teams have done even before I came to UW-Madison. But we have to start somewhere, right? We can't really start right away with this big enterprise strategy. So how do we get there? And this is where I'm going to be talking about how you actually can use a particular methodology to be able to do your software development. It's kind of related to even project methodology. So I'm going to touch on just 2 right at the beginning, just to level set, make sure everybody's on the same page. Then I'm going to dive into what I call the 4 Ds. It's just kind of my spin based on experience of some things that I believe will set you up for success if you really start to look at those things up front. Then we're going to talk about how you do your application development in agile sprints. We cannot talk about any kind of implementation without focusing on user acceptance testing, training, and then production support when you launch. Then I'm going to talk about our lessons learned and even give you some project examples of things that went right, things that went wrong, and where I feel like we had some successes. And I'm going to also talk about a failure, because you got to talk about those as well. That's where you learn your lessons, right? So from a methodology standpoint, I'm just going to touch on this really quickly because I'm no expert in this area, but basically to make sure that everybody has a general understanding of what I'm talking about if I use these terms, waterfall and agile. So from a waterfall standpoint, you're gathering all of your requirements up front, you design the solution, you do all of the development, and then you deliver the entire solution at once. Whereas with Agile, you gather a set of requirements, you do your design and your development and your delivery, and then you have that maintained, but then you go back and gather more requirements, and you just keep doing these things, in a circular fashion. From the standpoint of where I have worked with a prior institution, as well as even some time that I spent with a global implementation partner, picking one or the other, doing something waterfall or doing something completely agile doesn't necessarily work. So this is a hybrid approach. And I mentioned my prior time at another institution as well as an implementation partner, because what you're going to be seeing today, especially if you've worked with a partner, this is nothing new. This is not a new way of doing things. I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with this, but it really is a hybrid. It's a great blend of doing some things up front and then taking an agile approach to your development. My little spin on it is what I just call these 4Ds, and I'm going to be elaborating on this quite a bit throughout the presentation. But basically, it's blending a waterfall approach to discover all of your requirements and then follow that with an agile development process. It allows the project team to establish and document the scope and deliver the necessary artifacts. Artifacts meaning all that documentation that you're going to put together within a project. Because let's face it, when you get really busy, there's some things slip, and sometimes that's your documentation, and you really don't want to do that. You really want to stay on top of making sure that everything is documented properly. This will also allow you to surface data integrity issues early. So that's another one of these Ds up front. And I'm going to talk a lot about data issues throughout this presentation. And it gives you time to address complex design challenges. So the goal would be to get your design done up front so that as you move forward through this agile sprint development process, you can consistently come back and make sure that your design is meeting the requirements, or you make those adjustments as you go through it. So let's dive into what I'm referring to as these 4Ds. And the first one is discovery. This is to understand all of your requirements up front. And there's a few reasons why. For one thing, it allows you to solidify the scope, because a lot of times when you start to get into discovery, a lot of things start to come up, and you need to determine, okay, are those things that we really need to include in this project? Are they completely out of scope and we need to do them a later time? So you want to be able to uncover all of those things up front. This is also the time to identify and then fill the gaps, because as you're asking a lot of questions to your stakeholders, you might start to feel like there are some things that you're missing, and you might even have to bring additional stakeholders to the table. Because what if the CRM design or the process involves other people? You might really need to get their feedback as well to see how does what you're building impact their particular processes. This also helps you figure out what is your project scope as a whole and how that impacts your CRM users as well as your constituents. What if you need a user interface for this particular solution that you're building? So this is going to help you figure all of those things out. It's going to positively impact design, so you're being really responsible with your design, and it's going to help you maintain the project timeline. Again, going back to scope and scope creep, this is going to help you really keep that in order. So I mentioned documentation. Now, depending on if you're working within your particular team, if you're an admin, maybe you have a project management office, or maybe you are a project manager or business analyst, you might have a number of documents that you always have with your project. So of course that is going to differ, depending on your processes, your internal processes. But for one thing, you do really want to make sure that you've got your requirements well-defined and articulated in the way of a story. you don't necessarily have to write it exactly this way, but by keeping in mind the elements of a user story, which is defining your end user, specifying what they want, describing the benefits of that particular process, and then adding in acceptance criteria to test against, that's going to make sure that you've really got your requirements well outlined and thoroughly thought out. The other piece that I want to mention as far as documentation is process flows. And process flows are so incredibly important because this is going to help you really map out what is each user doing, what are the different systems that this process is touching, what are the data elements that are being fed into that. And it's also going to give you something that you can even review with your stakeholders even before you start building to make sure that you're not missing anything in the process that you're building. All right, the next one is data. And I mentioned that I'm probably going to talk about data a lot. And that's because this is where we have encountered so many issues when it comes to data, because when you think about it, when you're building a CRM, you've likely got your source system data coming in. You might be bringing in spreadsheets that your staff are using, and you probably are taking data pieces from a couple of different systems, and you might be spreading them out into different objects and using them in different ways. So it's really important to look at your data up front and really have a good understanding of what those data sources are and how you're going to be using it. So what is in scope for the project, what data is in scope, and what is the volume? So for example, what if you don't talk about volume with your stakeholders, and when you get into the project, they say, oh, well, yeah, we want to bring in all of our historical data. So we want to bring in hundreds of thousands of records, and they really don't need that. So figure those things out up front so that you can avoid those issues, throughout the project. Determine your integrations. What systems are you integrating with? What are your data migration methods? And then data cleansing. So this is super important too, because you're building the CRM. You do not want to bring in, garbage data, dirty data. You really want to make sure that everything is cleansed and that it can map appropriately to the fields that you're building. You can also use this for testing. So as you are figuring out what data that you're bringing in and you're able to load that into the solution that you're building, you can test against real data. And we have found that this has been really beneficial to our users because they're seeing data that they're familiar with. But also make sure that you're conducting data validation. So you bring it in, you spot check it, it looks good. I would personally recommend, and again, this is based on experience, is even document the records that you're validating so that if when you go live and suddenly your users are coming into other records and saying, oh, something's not right here, something didn't get mapped properly, you can go back to the original records that you validated, make sure that those still look okay, and then see, okay, what are the differences between these records we validated and the ones that are having some issues. So it might help you figure out what your root cause of any kind of data issues are a lot faster. Now, from a design standpoint, I believe personally, it's really helpful for you to design for the full scope of the project based on all of those requirements that you're gathering up front. The reason why that this is really helpful is it's going to help you reduce the potential for technical debt. And I'm going to speak to that in one of my examples later on in the presentation. It's also going to allow you to have really responsible architecture. So you're not putting on a bunch of band-aids later on. You're really thinking through what the design is, and you're making sure that it is scalable and it's really going to work within the CRM, especially if you have goals of expanding your CRM to other use cases. This is also going to help you really see what is that end-to-end user experience and all of those processes. So you're not seeing it in little chunks. You're able to really see the full thing so you can make sure that it's really going to work for the requirements that you've gathered. So now that we've talked a bit about some of those areas to really focus on up front, now let's talk about being flexible and being agile. And this is where you can take an agile development approach. So what you would be able to do after you've gathered your requirements and you've got a really good understanding of what this design, what this solution is going to look like, you can complete smaller chunks of work over short periods of time in sprints. This would allow you to frequently demonstrate the progress to your stakeholders so that they can stay involved. They're seeing that you're making progress, and it will also allow you to iteratively refine your requirements and groom those user stories. Grooming user stories, meaning that you have this requirement written out and you might have questions about it. You might need some clarification. So that's what I mean when I'm saying grooming. Now, here's one tip when you're thinking about these agile chunks of work, these sprints that you're working on. Combine your stakeholder and technical requirements into a single sprint. Here's an example. We've talked about data migration and integrations and things like that. So there's things that you're going to have to build behind the scenes that you really can't show anybody. Even if you're creating some cool flow, your end users aren't, oh, it looks great, but they might not really understand the importance of that flow. So think about some things that you can show them. If you've spent a couple of weeks doing all this back-end work, what are you going to show to your stakeholders? You can keep it simple. It might be something with page layouts, or it might be showing them some kind of an automation. So think about mixing those things together when you're planning out your different sprints for this agile development method. So now let's go into what I like to call an anatomy of a sprint. So here's the scenario. It's 3 sprints. They're 3 weeks each. Sprint 0, so discover, document, data, design, has already been completed. So we've made it through all of that, and we've identified the stories that we want to work on during the first sprint. So I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so you can see it. So the technical team has decided on, say, these 10 requirements. This is what we're going to build in sprint 1. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to put them in front of our stakeholders, those who have been designated on the project to really help support and refine requirements, and say, these are the things that we want to build. Are you all good with this? It gives you a time to answer questions because you've probably found gaps in the requirements, and make sure everything's really solid and good to go. Then for the rest of week 1 and the rest of week 2, your heads down. It is the development time. It's the time to do the quality assurance testing, making sure that you're able to get through all of those requirements, get everything built out, and you're constantly testing it through week 1 and week 2. Beginning of week 3, you bring the stakeholders back in and you do a demo and you show them, this is what we built. We did this with contacts. We did this with accounts. Here's this page layout. Look, here's this cool automation that we built. So you're showing them what you have built based on those 10 requirements that were identified. And this gives you some time for refinement. So the stakeholders might see, oh, that automation is great, but now that we're seeing it live, it really should be going to this person, not that person. Now, I'm making this up. So this is going to give you time for refinement. So you can make that little tweak. You can go back to them and say, okay, we made this change. How does this look? And they can give you their approval and say, yep, we are good to go. We like everything that we've seen. Now, at the end of week 3, you're done with that whole sprint. The tech team goes back in and they figure out, what are we going to work on for sprint 2? And then you just keep going in this circular fashion. So you make your way through all of your sprints. You've kept your stakeholders engaged. They're seeing you're making progress, and you're getting the feedback that you need to make sure what you're building is you're on the right track. All right. So the focus of this presentation, as I mentioned earlier, is more about, discovery, design, focusing on your data, and documenting everything. But I cannot talk about a project without talking about user acceptance testing, training, and production support for a launch, as I mentioned earlier in the agenda. So I want to touch on these things a little bit because These areas, they're super, super important to the success of your project. So user acceptance testing, UAT, this is allowing your stakeholders, your testers, to see the entire solution end to end. It allows you to identify the issues to be resolved prior to go live. So even though you have done these sprint demos, sometimes once the users get in there and you've got your data loaded, this is where they start to uncover things that you really do want to have fixed before you actually launch this to everyone. It also gives your testers exposure to the platform, so it's going to increase their comfort level. And this is also when those super users, those subject matter experts, those people start to surface. And these are the people that you want to really partner with when you go live, because they're the ones in the department who are going to be using the tool. They're going to be able to be champions for it. So this is a great time to identify them. And this is when you're doing your solution walkthrough for documentation and training purposes, because you need to prepare the documentation or the methods of training once everything is ready to go. So that leads me to training. This is absolutely essential. This is part of change management, and this is when you're going to get your users comfortable with the platform. Now, there's a lot of different ways that you can do training, and we've actually done several of these ourselves. So I've been involved in, years ago, we did live in-person training right there in a classroom with users. I've also done virtual training, and it works just as well, especially, you know, here we are post-pandemic. A lot of us are virtual, so take advantage of that. We've also done Train the Trainer, where we have done an in-depth overview with, say, an SME or super user that was identified in the department. So even though we did training with everybody up front, you know, departments have turnover, they have new hires. This allows somebody within the department to do the training rather than, you know, the admin having to go and do training as people are hired on. You want to have all your documentation done, the general terminology, what are the features, the specifics related to the solution. And then a couple of other things that we've done that worked out extremely well was a desktop video walkthrough, where it's only a couple of minutes and it's just showing the different clicks, the changes that you're making in the CRM solution. That has worked really well for us. And online courses. We use Canvas here at UW, and we've been able to also create online courses for CRM as well as for marketing automation. Now, when you launch, you need to have some production support, of course. So set the expectations for those super users that you have identified, so that everybody is comfortable with them answering questions, helping out new users, maybe helping out people who are nervous to use the new system. You know, so make sure everybody's clear on what the role of a super user is. Establish an issue reporting process. You don't want to leave people hanging. You don't want them to think that they're just out there and now they're trying to do something and they can't figure it out, or something is going wrong. Have a way for them to report the issues directly into the admin, and also have a way to prioritize those issues. So you might do a daily meeting. You might have an every other day meeting, just whatever is appropriate for the size and scope of your project. Make sure that you've got that identified as well. I did put on here, be available and patient. And the reason why I did this is, again, based on prior experience. I had users, wasn't CRM, it was for a different product, and this was years ago, but they were so nervous. They were nervous about how this new technology is going to affect their job. They were frustrated because they couldn't understand it right away. And so now you're dealing with people who are upset. They might even be angry because they can't figure it out. So really, this is a time to just be really patient and understand that people are just nervous. They might be having an emotional reaction to this that you don't even quite understand. So just patience, very important here. And get management support. Get their directors or their managers on board so that they can see, you know, leadership is involved. They're supportive of this new solution. It's really going to help with adoption. All right, lessons learned. Now, here are the lessons from what we have discovered over time, and I don't want this to sound like I'm kind of, backtracking on doing all of these things up front, because you do learn so much over time, but it is just a reminder that you need to be flexible and you need to be ready to refine the work that you've already done. What happens is these sprint demos and the user acceptance testing surface additional or changes to requirements. It is inevitable. So you might have to backtrack. You might have to make sure that your requirements are supplemented, your documentation is updated. How do these new things impact your data? And most importantly, how is this impacting the design of the solution that you are putting out there? So this is just a reminder that, yes, try as much as you can to do a lot of this work up front. But remember that that is the beauty of doing an agile sprint development process. It's the beauty of user acceptance training. It's going to give you more information. So go back, make sure you stay flexible, and be ready to refine some of the things that you've done as responsibly as you can to make sure that everything is still scalable, it works for your solution, and really you've just got all of your bases covered. Okay. Now I'm going to give you 3 examples of projects that we have done where we have followed our methodology. Maybe we did follow our methodology, and the outcomes of those particular projects. So the first one this was the MVP. And this is going back to the pandemic, and we were tasked with bringing together several different groups on campus. It was our health services, our housing unit, and the conference centers. And they needed to identify students who were testing positive for COVID, those who were their roommates, and be able to move them into, isolation or quarantine spaces. So we had to move fast, and we had to blend a lot of different data sources and a lot of different people all together to make this work. So we were working with disparate source systems. We had multiple stakeholder groups. They all had different processes, different roles and responsibilities in this. We needed to move really fast, but this was going to be a temporary solution, but meeting a very significant need. What went right is the stakeholders dedicated the time and they worked collaboratively. So those 3 departments that I mentioned that are all completely separate, they came to the virtual table every day and we're working together to make this happen. We gathered most of the requirements up front and we prioritized that work so we could get it done fast. And we immediately started working on data migration. We formed a work group to put all of that data together, make sure everything was in order, and had that designated group working together so that we could bring in those integrations and blend all of that data into single contact records and single case records. What went wrong is that we didn't gather all of the requirements up front. So that discovery of doing all that up front, we had to prioritize the requirements we were gathering because we had to move so quickly. So we left some things on the table, and guess what that resulted in? Some solution design and rework after we were already in production. So we had a little technical debt there. Unrelated to our methodology, we encountered some technical issues from one of our source systems, and it just really impacted our time. We were doing a lot of time-consuming production support, so that kind of went wrong. So from the standpoint of the 4Ds, I would say our documentation was in order. We managed to work on the data right away. Our discovery, I mentioned that we didn't get everything up front and it impacted the design. However, we really did follow our project methodology almost 100%. So I would give this a very positive rating. The next one is I'm calling it practice what you preach, because we should have practiced what we preach. We had one stakeholder group. We were bringing in 2 flat files and had a system integration. This was a very custom solution with, really specific, like with coding, like that level of customization. And it was a very new process and replacement for an Access database and multiple spreadsheets. So what went right is we originally had a business analyst and a business owner. We had some usable requirements, and we were making really good use of native CRM functionality, such as list views and reports. What went wrong? A lot of things. One is that our business owner left and was not replaced. So we really did not have anyone on that side to really keep things in order, keep the our stakeholders kind of on the right path. We didn't evaluate the data early in the project, and it continued to change. So not only the data that we were bringing in from survey data, but even one of the system integrations that we had. So as the data elements changed, that means we had to change what was in CRM. We had to change the fields and the way we were bringing in data. So that ended up being a challenge. And frankly, we just didn't have good structure. We didn't follow our project methodology. So I would say our documentation was good throughout. The design didn't change a whole lot. It was a custom design, and we were able to do that up front based on generally what we knew. But the discovery continued to go on. The working with the data just felt like it was endless. So I would say we didn't follow our project methodology. So this project did not go as well as we wanted. I'm going to get through the last one quickly here because I see we've only got about 9 minutes left. The last one, hooray, we walked the talk. So you can walk the walk, you can walk the talk. This one, we stuck to our methodology. We had one stakeholder group. We had several data sources, spreadsheets, lots of spreadsheets. But when you're bringing in a lot of spreadsheets into different objects and you need to take different pieces of spreadsheets and put it in one object, that is a challenge. We were using standard CRM capabilities. We had really, really strong business ownership. So what went right? We stuck with the methodology despite hiccups. We evaluated that data early. We made sure it was cleansed early. We had the right people in the right roles from a project standpoint. What went wrong? Gaps in knowledge transfer. So we ended up having a pretty big staffing change, and it resulted in us redoing discovery. Now, that's painful. It was a little painful for our business owners, but we did it because we wanted to stick with our methodology. We wanted to make sure that we had everything discovered up front. We did have some competing priorities, a little stopping and starting, but that's just the name of the game sometimes, especially when you've got little departments that have big initiatives that they're working on and they need to be fully focused on those things. And data record mapping was a challenge. So I mentioned kind of the spreadsheets and the objects. It took longer than we anticipated, but we stuck with our methodology. And so we had really good discovery, really good documentation. The data was a challenge. The design had to keep shifting because of the data, the data challenges. But overall, we followed it, and this was probably our most successful project. All right, we have 7 minutes for questions.
Excellent. Plan and it all works out sometimes, right, Kyla? That's terrific. Those are great examples. Thank you for sharing those specific nuts and bolts of those examples too. I think that's really meaningful. We do have a question in the Q&A, and it kind of goes, I think, to a little bit the global and dealing with stakeholders. And the question is, what is the biggest challenge in enforcing those 4 Ds in cases where a stakeholder says, we just need this done, we don't have forever, we got to go? How do you handle that challenge?
That is a great question. And what we really have to reinforce is that now this is for us. So you might have to, structure this based on what your implementation is, but we are working towards enterprise CRM, meaning it has to work for the entire campus. So we have to be very, very careful about what our design is. We got to make sure it's scalable. We want to make sure that we are creating as much standardization as possible so that lots of other groups can work on it. So we really just try to reinforce that. But even prior to that, when we kick off a project, we do go through a presentation that makes it really clear how this project is going to unfold and the different areas that we're going to be focusing on. So some of what I showed you today is in the presentation I give to our stakeholders, but it's written a lot differently. For those of you here today, I made an assumption that Many of you are in technology. You might be CRM users already or looking at it. So you probably have some understanding of, some of this jargon. I put that in very more business type jargon so that they're understanding more things about, I don't talk about story grooming, for example. I talk about that in more of, we're going to ask you questions and make sure that we're covering everything that you need. So I really reinforce that piece up front so that they know they've got to stay engaged, they've got to dedicate the time. And we figure that out early on. And I'll give one example is that we had timing recently for a launch, but one group had, they couldn't do it. They were working on orientation. So we had to pivot and go live with one group and then onboard that other group a couple months later because they simply could not, they couldn't accommodate the project schedule. So reinforce it. Do your best to try and stay on track, but if not, be ready to pivot and try to accommodate the best that you can.
This is kind of another stakeholder related question that kind of feeds into that. And you mentioned it when you had a business owner in one of your examples who left, times you've had to go back and redocument. And I also kind of look at training. Sometimes we have staff turnover, people leave. Has train the trainer really kind of been the answer for dealing with departments or colleges or users or user groups where your key contacts or super users leave? Kind of how have you kind of dealt with that? I know in many cases, higher ed's a revolving door of staff. So I'm wondering how you tackle that when you do such a great job of planning at the beginning and having the whole UAT kind of model.
You know what, we have used, I think probably all of those examples I gave, we have used, and not only with CRM, but also with our marketing automation solution, Eloqua. So with the pandemic example I gave, we had student workers. So tons of turnover kind of all the time. That's where the desktop recordings came in. So I did, I think, one, maybe two, where it was just my voice, it was CRM on the screen, and I was showing how you go through and create a case, update a case, all of those things. And so the directors over within housing would use those videos to show the new students coming in how to do things and then just kind of monitor them and answer their questions. For our marketing automation solution, we've created a Canvas course. So it is bite-sized chunks of information on how to use that particular tool. I also think that in our pre-enrollment space, our admins over there also created a course for new users. And then from the train the trainer perspective, we've done that also, again, with CRM as well as with our marketing automation. So it really depends on the size of the department. Sometimes when they're smaller, they might not really have somebody to be able to do that. So our admins will do the training, but when they're a much bigger group, an SME will take on that responsibility. So they are the ones that are training. So it's really, again, it's just being flexible and really just kind of evaluating their circumstances and then choosing the right method for the people involved, the size of the department.
And like what you said, be available and be patient, which is good advice in life in general and dealing with everybody. Kyla, thank you so very much. This was, I was going to throw more D verbs at you, but it is developing an incredible, I think, skill set for everybody. So thank you so much for sharing today. Successes, failures, but boy, it's really nothing but success. For those of you who are now going to be departing this session, you can select the sessions logo on the left to go back to the main schedule and go to your next events. Please visit our sponsors by selecting Expo. We couldn't do this without those sponsors. Roundtables are happening shortly. And a couple of times today, session recordings are going to be available on YouTube within 2 days. 48 hours, evidently, is our promise. So that's a lot of work on behalf of the planning committee of this event. So thank you all for being here today. And Kyla, thank you for taking the time in sharing so much insight and expertise with all of us. And everybody else, enjoy the rest of Higher Ed Dreamin. Bye, gang.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day. Thank you, Quentin. Bye.